I'll sit down. I'll sit down. Well, hello, Ogeta. Good day, true Wantags. Talofa lava, malolele, and very warm Pacific greetings in all the sacred cultures and languages of our region. My job is to be the facilitator, and it's an honour to do that with this very esteemed panel. So I thought I would invite them to just come and sit with me. It feels like the Lone Ranger sitting up here. So could our panel please come so I can introduce each of you. So thank you. Before I introduce our esteemed panel, because I think it's very important that we hear the voices of our kin and our family in the region, I wanted to just share a very brief reflection on the Right Honourable Valvasa Manaya, Winston Peters' keynote speech. And the reflection is that we peoples of the Pacific are unique and different, but we're not a minority in the world. And we are not a passive actor. And he talked about his own genealogy in relation to Ngāti Wai, people of the sea. We are peoples of the sea and ocean. That is the biggest ocean in the world. It's a unifier. New Zealand is a Pacific country. It is in our DNA. And New Zealand is part of the Pacific. She doesn't sit outside the Pacific. We're family, we're kin and our neighbours. We're people of faith, and in our diversity, we're about unity. He talked about there's much to celebrate, but there are many challenges that are taking far too long to be addressed, and they're deadly serious. So the importance of listening, of understanding, and seeing in the Pacific way that they're two-way relationships and they're of respect. So, and the importance of sustainability. You know, that word gets bandied around. What does it mean to the everyday person who's working on the plantation? So it is my pleasure indeed to introduce this esteemed panel to you. Now, don't accuse me of pālangi time, because we only have 75 minutes. So what I've done is, if you don't mind, introduce each of the panellists, and they will speak for 8 minutes. And then have a little bit of a panel discussion between them. And then we want to open it up to the floor for any questions. And please, it's not a speech. It's important to keep the questions brief and succinct so we can hear the voices of the panellists. So on my left is Honourable Minister Ralph Regan-Vanu. And Ralph is currently serving his 3rd term as the Member of Parliament for Port Vila and is Vanuatu's Minister for Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and External Trade. Ralph has a background on cultural heritage management with a focus on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage and customary land tenure systems. Welcome, Ralph. Further on my left is Karina Lyons, who's had a career in foreign affairs in New Zealand, and she's a Pacific woman, and she's the Vice President, Executive Director, Research and Director of the Pacific Islands Development Program in East West Centre, Hawaii. On my right, and a fabulous alma mater of Victoria University of Wellington, is the High Commissioner, the Cook Islands High Commissioner to New Zealand, Her Excellency Elizabeth Wright, who was born and raised in Rarotonga and has an amazing background in both private and public sectors. And then further on my right is Dr. Audrey O'Moore, who's the Deputy Director General for the Pacific Community in Fiji. She has led the SPC Suva office since March 2016, and has been responsible for the executive leadership and management of SPC Suva operations, including over 400 staff. Lucky Fiji, Audrey. So we will now introduce the panellists to present their vision or response about Pacific Reset. And Honourable Ralph Renjavanu, I hand it to you.
Thank you, Dame Winnie, and I'd like to first of all acknowledge the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, Deputy Prime Minister of Samoa, our colleague Minister Sio, Dame yourself, ambassadors, excellencies, all the guests, all the young people. It's a great honour to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot and learning a lot, because New Zealand is one of our main partners, and we need to, for us in Vanuatu, it's, especially at the policy level, it's important for us to understand what's happening in New Zealand, what the thinking is, so we can interact better, especially in the context of the reset. So Vanuatu, we're, as you know, way over the west, and I want to just echo something that the Deputy Prime Minister said, which is that part of the reset is getting New Zealanders, ordinary New Zealanders, to understand why the Pacific is important and why there is a reset. And one of the first parts of that, I think, for us in Melanesia, is to get New Zealanders to understand that Pacific is not just Polynesia, which is a common perception in New Zealand. When people think of the Pacific, they think of Samoa, Cook Islands, you know, but they never think of Vanuatu, Solomons, Papua New Guinea, which is where most of the population is. I know it's much more difficult to think about, perhaps, than your nearest neighbours, but that's an important thing that needs to happen in New Zealand as part of the reset. Vanuatu and New Zealand have enjoyed a long relationship. In Vanuatu, we are, of course, one of the Pacific's least developed countries. We're an LDC. We're about to graduate next year, at the end of next year. We have been engaged in a long process of negotiating with the United Nations about including the criteria of vulnerability as one of the criteria for graduation from LDC. We began that discussion with the UN system about, must have been 15 years ago. We are not going to benefit from it, but we are pushing for Tuvalu and Kiribati and Solomons for that criteria to be included when considering their graduation, because they are seriously vulnerable. And in the case of Vanuatu, for example, a good example is Tropical Cyclone Pam, the last big cyclone that hit us in 2015, wiping out, you know, over 60% of our GDP in one event, setting development back years. When you're talking about graduation and a linear path of development, you're not taking into account these kind of events, which actually put you way back on the development pathway. So for Vanuatu, our main concern is, as a least developed country, just getting the capacity and the development we need to meet the basic needs of our population. Water supply, for example, is a key area we collaborate with New Zealand on. New Zealand is very active in our water sector, and I was previously the minister responsible for water resources as well as land. And it was very good to see that partnership based on experience and partnership with UNICEF, UNDP, delivering water supply to our population, but also reforming the whole system of water supply, trying to make it more sustainable, make communities more able to manage water systems that were put in, that kind of thing. Education, of course, we have some of the least, you know, the lowest educated populations in the Pacific, in Vanuatu. We invest a quarter to a third of our national budget in education. It's our biggest single item. Still, it's the biggest challenge for us. And we continue to seek opportunities to provide more training and education opportunities for our population, not only formal training, but particularly skills development. I want to talk also about one of the areas that we're collaborating closely with New Zealand in terms of the Pacific reset is community policing, which is something where, you know, New Zealand has a very key, probably a unique role in the Pacific in understanding this bicultural context for law enforcement and providing order in communities. And that's very important to us because we have a largely cultural, I would say, traditional economy base. Most of the organisation of communities in Vanuatu is done under community leadership, under community leaders. The state is pretty much absent from most of Vanuatu. So it's important that everything we deliver in terms of development involves this community leadership. And a recent initiative of our government is decentralisation through strengthening local area councils. So this is a new direction we've embarked on in the last 3 years. It's going very well. It's a new model for service delivery that actually uses local area councils at local level, of which there are 72 in Vanuatu, so much more decentralised than the provincial model that's been in existence till now, which is 6 provinces. And in each of those provincial councils, you have the key stakeholders. The chief is always the chairman, and then you have the women's rep, business rep, persons with disabilities, youth rep. I'm probably forgetting some, but that becomes the unit of decision making and also the unit at which the budget is devolved to. So we're starting to devolve much more of our budget slowly down to that level rather than to the provinces. And that is the level where the community policing will come in. And this is a good example of a very niche area where New Zealand expertise is probably the only one that can help us in this area. I just want to say that for Vanuatu, in terms of interaction in the international sphere, we have a National Sustainable Development Plan, which is our development plan and vision till 2030. It aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. But very much, it's one of the first times we actually developed a plan from the grassroots up. I was involved in the process. I was the co-chair of that process, which took us about 2 years or 3 years. It built on from the previous development plans. But it's all about development based on our values. We've identified our values. They're in our constitution. They're our traditional Melanesian values. They're Christian principles. They are faith in God. Those are the founding values which all our development will be based on. And this vision we are trying to implement. And everything we do in our international interactions will align with building this NSDP, this vision, the programs you have set out. So at this time of increasing interest in the Pacific from all partners, increasing geopolitical significance, we are looking to maximize the opportunity to implement our plan for ourselves, that we have set for ourselves. We have also, something we share with New Zealand, I think, is we have actually mainstreamed indicators of Pacific well-being into our measurement of our progress. So we're not just measuring GDP, we're measuring building of community strength, we're measuring knowledge of language, we're measuring participation in ceremonies that build you as part of the community. So these are integral to how we measuring how we develop. And so in these terms also, I think we have a very strong connection with New Zealand, because New Zealand, as we know, is probably the most Pacific society in the Pacific in terms of the representation of Pacific Island groups here. And this unique bicultural development in the Pacific, in New Zealand, also represents the fact that in Vanuatu we have over 100 different cultures, which we're trying to move together in one national project or one national plan. So these are some things which make it very useful for Vanuatu and very helpful for Vanuatu to engage more and get more engagement from New Zealand and step up, or rather reset, in terms of our engagement, because I think we will be trying to learn a lot from what is happening here and the way that New Zealand is interacting with the rest of the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister Ralph Regenvanu, and now Her Excellency Elizabeth Wright Korteka, the High Commissioner to New Zealand for the Cook Islands.
Thank you, Dame Winnie. At the outset, please let me associate myself with the greetings that have gone before and say to everybody, kia ora ana and good morning. It's indeed an honor for me to be here this morning to present alongside such esteemed panelists and to offer you the Cook Islands perspective of the theme of resetting the Pacific. I commend NZIIA for this year's conference theme, Pacific Futures, Connections, Identity and Security, particularly given the recent focus within the region on these issues, including at this year's Pacific Leaders Forum. The theme of Pacific Futures is indeed a timely one amidst the talks of climate change emergencies, threats to the security of our region, and rumors of geopolitical maneuvering by the region's international partners. Indeed, one only has to look at the initiatives by our larger counterparts, New Zealand's Reset, Australia's Step Up, UK's Uplift, to see the renewed interest other countries are taking in our blue continent. In my briefing for this session, it mentioned that New Zealand and Australia have different approaches to regional diplomacy. I'm not sure if you had, and I'm sure that you will have seen some of these issues and topics of much contention at this year's Pacific Leaders Forum. Both countries have employed strategies that at their heart are intended to rework how they deliver aid and their approach to partnership within the region. These resets, step-ups, have publicly acknowledged the need to reconsider their engagement within the region, given the shifting, rapidly evolving geopolitical dynamics currently at play. It is interesting to note, though, that over time, the region has become something of a strategic hub, with non-traditional partners showing greater interest in enhanced engagement. The way that aid is delivered in the Pacific has shifted, where aid has traditionally been granted towards committed projects with little flexibility for recipient countries to shift priorities as might be required. The increased interest by emerging partners has resulted in greater flexibility to aid being granted. This is something that the Cook Islands has been advocating for a long time, to allow us to reallocate funding as priorities shift, enabling greater control of our development agenda. I think it is because of these current geopolitics within the region that these new approaches to countries are conducting business in the Pacific are so important. Not necessarily in terms of economic announceables or new infrastructure initiatives, but rather the intent and the authenticity behind this renewed impetus. In order for any of these strategies to truly carry any weight, our partners need to engage with the Pacific in a way that is genuine, it's sincere, and it wants to see the region develop and succeed. We are swimming in a sea of initiatives, policies, strategies, all intended to demonstrate concern for our country's well-beings. But actions speak louder than words. When countries' actions do not match the rhetoric, one cannot help but question the sincerity of the intent. The Cook Islands will be the first Pacific Island nation to graduate to developed country status under the OECD development criteria on the 1st of January 2020. It has necessarily meant that we have needed to reconsider our donor-recipient relationships in this context of graduation. So for us, our reset began many years ago. We have, over the last decade, undertaken a number of significant reforms to achieve ownership of our development agenda. More recently, we've completed our medium-term fiscal impact strategy. We are currently engaging in national consultations for our economic development strategy, which we hope to complete next year. We've also begun discussing what our relationship will look like with our international partners post-graduation. Our traditional partner has always been New Zealand because of our constitutional and our historical ties. New Zealand's response to discussions of our relationship post-graduation has reaffirmed their commitment to reset in the region. And in my view, it goes a long way to speaking to the intent behind this initiative. Other partners have signified that aid and other types of assistance to the Cook Islands will cease upon our graduation. We've expected this, and whilst we welcome the opportunity to shift away from donor-recipient relationships to partnerships premised on mutual understanding, the reality of the OECD criteria is that vulnerability to the impacts of climate change and natural disasters do not factor when taken into consideration when assessing a country's development status. This means that these discussions around reset, the step up, the uplift, are increasingly important to the Cook Islands. These policies bring with them funding that is often targeted at building resilience in the region. And the Cook Islands, being a private sector-led economy with a GDP that is reliant on tourism, is also a GDP reliant on shocks to resilience. This means, like Vanuatu, if we have one severe natural disaster, our developed country status will be no more, and we will find it extremely difficult to recover. This is why, for us, economic diversification is currently one of our top priorities. We are looking to non-traditional means of ensuring our livelihoods are protected in any scenario. We have been reliant on a single service-driven industry for long enough, and with ODA graduation are now looking towards more increased trade, the opportunities presented by seabed minerals exploration, expansion of financial services, and increased engagement with multilateral organizations such as the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. However, we acknowledge that such steps can only take a small island state vulnerable to the impacts of climate change so far. For us, climate change, resilience, economic status, and genuine partnerships are very much tied together. Climate finance, for instance, should not be tied to ODA criteria. And the Cook Islands has really worked hard to be able to directly access climate change financing. It should be recognized that development in one key area doesn't equate to resilience. And countries should be cautious of debasing their public commitments to enhance engagement in the region when their own domestic and foreign policies, as well as their stance on aid, often say otherwise. Our Deputy Prime Minister made during a keynote address at the Centre for International Development conference 1 year ago that the Cook Islands welcomes the reset, but such an initiative must be genuine and must bring all parties involved to the table with respect. This is something that all countries currently seeking to re-engage with the region have struggled to achieve in the past. When considering the development of the region, we would also do well to appreciate the significant and intergenerational contributions of Pacific countries to the development of New Zealand and Australia. Pacific diplomacy and regional solidarity should not be underestimated. The region is becoming a heavily contested space, and it's no longer enough to simply announce initiatives, particularly if these initiatives are not developed and implemented through meaningful consultation and respectful communication. Again, I want to stress that actions speak louder than words. The Cook Islands certainly welcomes the reset. It welcomes all other pursuits that aim to bolster development in the region. And we just want to reinforce that these efforts have to be respectful, holistic, and recognize the span of wide-reaching development aspirations of Pacific countries. In conclusion, I just want to pick up on 3 key points that have been mentioned by earlier speakers. And I certainly agree with the Deputy Prime Minister when he said that in talking about the New Zealand media and how it has to change its mindset. I think Pacific Reset have to do more in resetting, not only in New Zealand media, New Zealand academia, and also the New Zealand private sector. It has to do more Pacific resetting. It has to recognize that the Pacific has moved on. The mindset has to change and have a lot more respect for Pacific and its people. The second point I'd like to make in concluding is that, in our view, the Pacific Reset obligates New Zealand to help us magnify our voices on the international stage. Not to speak on our behalf. We're quite capable of doing that ourselves. But however, rather to create the space that will allow us to speak for ourselves and let our voices be heard. And thirdly, and in my last point, is I just want to re-emphasize the DPM's comment on listening and deepening understanding. We know our priorities best. Nobody knows our priorities like we do. And please respect our prioritization. We've gone through a lot of effort of strengthening our own systems, the way that we do things to ensure that development outcomes are beneficial for our people. So respect our prioritization, our priorities. On that note, once again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak today and reiterate the importance of this year's conference theme. Tato waiwolo kia manuia.
Me taki mata. The voices of our women are very important. So thank you very much, Your Excellency, Elizabeth Wright-Korteka. I now have much pleasure in introducing Dr. Audrey Aumua, Deputy Director General for SPC.
Thank you. Dame Winnie Laban, thank you very much. Nisan Bulavinaka and kia ora koutou. And good morning to all of you, Honourable Ministers, Peter Williams, Honourable Minister Ralph, delegates and speakers. I note the ambassadors that are here, Nisan Bulavinaka to you, and greetings from the Pacific community. And of course, I want to acknowledge the youthful faces in the room. It's a pleasure to sit here and to look at all of you. Thank you for the invitation, Melanie, to be here this morning, and of course to join you all on a really critical and important discussion around Pacific futures. Allow me to make a few reflections about how regional organisations are viewing change in the region, and in particular around the youth agenda, a theme that is very close to my heart. Minister Peters reflected this morning on, he made an interesting statement about the real complexity of the Pacific and how at this current time we have never seen such challenges in this region as before, and rightly so. In fact, it was the one thing I did agree with him on besides the rugby. But the question I have for him, of course, is after 70 years of investment and capacity building and accompaniment by many of our partners, collectively and collaboratively, we still see our region in a state of chaos and crisis. And there are a number of issues, I think, that we should explore in trying to understand this particular challenge, and maybe some of those discussions will happen today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Pacific community, let me give you a quick brief overview. I'm aware I've got 8 minutes, but SPC, the Pacific community, is the oldest and largest development organisation in the region. We work in support of the 26 countries that we serve, and we tackle some of the most complex sustainable development challenges, such as climate change, fisheries science, disaster resilience, climate-smart agriculture, and of course much more. And I am pleased to say that a lot of those technical areas, in particular oceans and fisheries, New Zealand has been a strong supporter of those particular spaces. We also provide a lot of support to the countries in the areas of human and social development, including public health, human rights, gender equality, violence against women, youth culture, statistics, and education. And much of the priorities of our organisation is driven by our leaders. So when it comes to this region's youth, we have a pressing interest, which is why I'm really pleased to have been invited here to speak a little bit about some of the youth challenges. I wanted to just mention this issue of social change and opportunity and how this is important, but often not well understood by our development partners and our donors. Given we are talking about resetting in the Pacific, my sense is that social change should really be at the heart of many of these discussions, both from a policy perspective, but also from a development practice perspective. And you've heard already from two countries about their challenges from ranges of not only food security, but climate change. But I think what often we are missing in a lot of regional dialogue is the human and social development piece. So every change, whether it's social change or other, does require a little bit of a push. And many of our donors and our development partners have enabled that push to happen. But it is much more than a single pebble being thrown into an ocean. As much more pebbles are added and a point is reached where the ripples of a water become waves and a real movement for change begins, we can then see real development change and sustainable development. There was a paper recently in Science magazine that the magic number to drive change in any given group is 25%. And if you can get a quarter of any group actively advocating for social change, that change has a good chance of succeeding. So if we think about the challenges of the young people in our region, health, social protection, education and employment opportunities, voice and leadership, and participation are critical, long-standing and key challenges for our youth. And youth justifiably are very, very concerned about their own future in our region, not just because of the climate impacts, but also because of their disillusionment with political leadership that appears to be forging a future for them without their voices being heard. And it's really interesting, those of you who follow regional politics will know that in our recent election in Nauru, that we now have a new cabinet at the average age of 35. So, change is ahead. The last state of the Pacific Youth Report in 2011 determined that very little had changed in our youth situation in the region. Research found that while some young people have improved education and access to health and other services, a significantly sized youthful population in our region still lacked services to various reasons, mostly vulnerable issues around discrimination. Key segments of our youth population face many degrees of marginalisation, from mainstream development efforts, which include young women, rural youth, and a really high profile of youth who are not in employment and not in education and are not in further training. This is a real bulge in the region. And it's interesting to note some of the most recent statistics in youth is that 75% of our young people are not likely to experience any kind of formal employment in the region. We also have a lot of discrimination, I think, in the region because of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, of course, young people now with disabilities. So I haven't painted a very pretty picture, but I know that many youth in our region feel that there is little that they can do to really make a difference. So just getting back to this 25%. The youth in the Pacific actually have more potential power than they know. Our youth population between the ages of 15 and 24 currently represent nearly 20% of all Pacific people in our region. And if you start to include 15-year-olds, this number rises to nearly 35%. In other words, a strong united voice for social change in this region's youth would be a very powerful way to create a wave of change that could not be ignored. It's really important to know too that many of our countries define youth very differently. In Samoa, and I notice the DPM's not here, but youth are classified up to the age of 35. So this is again is a real interesting challenge for the way governments, well, that's the Samoans for you. But there is a growing movement in the region globally with youth mobilizing, and you would have seen this on the global stage already. No longer are our young people silent on issues. They are demanding to sit at the table, to have input in governance, leadership and development. And I think the question for us, of course, is how are we going to support them in this effort? And can our development partners find a way to make them central to their development policies? This is such a key time for many development partners, including New Zealand and Australia, who have all announced recently their revised policies for engagement in the region. And they're very positive nicknames: Step Up, Set, Reset, and of course Uplift. Australia, New Zealand, and more recently the United Kingdom have been long partners in this region for more than 70 years. In fact, they are the founding members of the Pacific community, of this organisation that I represent. So they sit at the governance level of this organisation, and I wanted to share that because this speaks to the importance of the strategic alliance and history that Minister Peters referenced that these three countries have had in the region, and have played very big historical roles, mostly in building capacity and, of course, responding to development needs. The re-engagement, and I use the word re-engagement because this is a new way of thinking about development in the region, is very, very welcomed. And it also means for organisations such as ourselves that in particular New Zealand and Australia are really beginning to reinvest in areas that are important to us, particularly non-communicable diseases, agriculture, climate adaptation, fisheries and more, and I'm sure this afternoon's panels will talk much more to that. So here's my key point. People-centred development has always not been a central theme for development policies in the region. And my sense is in the current reset and the step-up policies, it is not as explicit as it should be. So we've learned in this region that after many decades of development, that sustainable development and change, whether it's in the areas of climate, fisheries and oceans and so forth, without the human and social development dimension at the centre of all change, nothing will happen, nothing will change. Our youth and our women are particularly affected when development doesn't go well, and youth issues are often sidelined from general development priorities in favour of issues with clearer evidence bases that have limited access to resources of funds. So in short, Pacific issues, no matter which way you shape it, are youth issues. We can't problem solve in the region without the input and leadership of young people helping shape our future. And of course there is still time. The development policy of the region are driven by politics and popularity. The squeaky wheel does get the grease, as the old saying goes, but if youth can use their influence to create that 25% movement, they can change the focus and direction of policy, helping to shape their own futures. And let me just say in conclusion, it's actually not about more money. It is actually about the partnership, the accompaniment, the collaborative way in which we problem solve together. And it's actually not about more money, and our leaders were very clear in Tuvalu when they said that. So when I think about New Zealand and I think about Australia and I think about the posture in which they are moving towards stronger accompaniment in the region, I do want to think about and ask our development partners, what is the change they want to see in the region? Is it marginal? Is it business as usual? Or is there real adaptive change that underpins the new way of thinking around these policies? Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you.
Vinaka Vakalevu, Dr. Audrey Aumua. I have much pleasure in introducing Karina Lyons, and you will see the bios. They're quite in detail in your program document. Not only is she the Queen of the East West Centre in Hawaii, but she's from New Zealand and she has a background in law. And over to you now, Karina.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā iwi o te motu nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kasalilie, Yakwe, Ali, I greet you with a heart full of aloha from the North Pacific. I'm humbled and honored to share this space with such a celebrated and decorated panel. And I'm even more humbled than usual because while I made my connection through Sydney last night, my luggage did not. So I arrived at sort of 1 or 2 in the morning in these very clothes. That is the smell that you smell. But I trust, given the caliber of this room, that my clothes will not preclude you hearing what I have to say. But my massive hair may mean that I can't hear what you say. So I'm conscious that you're trying to run the panel, so I will stop if you call me for time. I did prepare 9 minutes, but I'll just, with your leave, Madam Chair. 3 topics I wanted to cover in my 9 minutes: how the Pacific views New Zealand's reset, how a more inclusive concept of Pacific agency is required for stable and robust regionalism, and how I think we, especially youth, should manifest our Pacific agency. But a couple of points about perspective before I begin. In my experience working in the North Pacific, especially as New Zealand's ambassador responsible for implementing the Pacific reset in the Federated States of Micronesia, FSM, the Marshall Islands and Palau, and advocating for the PACER Plus trade deal to 3 countries who still have not signed, I learned that New Zealanders and Australians do tend to have an unconscious South-Pacific-centric perspective, a point well made by His Excellency. And I wanted to echo that. This is a Pacific Connections conference, so in the spirit of being as inclusive as possible, I want to use my platform to highlight perspectives from the North insofar as I'm able. But for the record, I'm a Samoan New Zealander. My mother would kill me if I didn't say that. And I'm repping West Auckland. Secondly, I wanted to emphasize that we're having a foreign policy discussion, but as Pacific Islanders going about our daily lives, these policy questions are being answered by the decisions we're making in our own lives. So what we do every day, that's what Pacific Islander agency looks like. So with those prelim points in mind, first topic, the reset. And I'm actually glad Minister Peters has stepped out because I've just retired from the Foreign Service. So the reset. In the Marshalls, FSM and Palau, it's less of a reset and more of a set, like a first set. Until recently, New Zealand's total aid contribution to these 3 PIF countries was well less than 1% of New Zealand's total aid budget for the Pacific. There are reasons for this. Following World War I, the League of Nations mandate system delegated the German administration of German territories in the South Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. And when the mandate system morphed into the trustee administration system following World War II, that same delineation continued. So New Zealand focused the majority of its foreign policy and development efforts in areas of the Pacific close to home. And as our Pacific community in New Zealand grew and shaped our country, this made policy sense. So fast forward back to the present, it's fair to say that as a PIF member, New Zealand is a recognised partner in FSM, the Marshalls and Palau. But they don't know us very well, and truthfully, we don't know them very well. With the Pacific reset, New Zealand's development money has significantly increased in the so-called compact states. It's increased to 15 million. So this is still about 1% of the Pacific aid budget, but it's enough to be genuinely useful. But if New Zealand does want to embed itself as a partner of choice alongside Japan, Taiwan, China, Australia, and of course the main player in the North Pacific who spends the most money by hundreds of millions, but they get the least amount of credit, the US, my advice to the New Zealand government is to listen to what the Pacific Islanders, have to say. Listen to what they say that they want. And what do they want? So this brings me to the second question on the connection between an inclusive concept of Pacific agency and a stable and robust regionalism. How does that picture of Pacific agency shift when North Pacific voices are invited to the conversation? So the East West Centre in Honolulu, where I now work, is home to the Pacific Islands Development Program. It's a crop agency. So if you work for MFAT or Defence or a minister, please update your brief. There are 9 crop agencies. SBC is the oldest. They do fabulous work. PIDP is also a crop agency, and they have a new sheriff. It's also the only crop agency that's based in the US, and it's also undergoing a reset itself. We've undertaken to amplify the voices of the Micronesian communities, both in Hawaii, because they experience a lot of discrimination there, and at the national level. So PIDP on Monday this week held a Micronesian Conference of Leaders. FSM was represented by the President, David Panuelo. Palau was represented by the Vice President, Oilo, and the Marshals was also represented by the Vice President. So what did the leaders have to say? First of all, the North Pacific states don't seem concerned about this over-securitization critique of US re-engagement, Australia's step up, or New Zealand's reset. Far from being defensive about being seen by the big countries through the lens of their strategic and security concerns, they wanted to partner, collaborate, and leverage in pursuit of their national interests. For example, they wanted to leverage their strategic importance to pressure the US, whom President Panuelo describes as FSM's closest ally and partner, to focus on climate change as a security issue in the Pacific. The North Pacific countries also want assistance that's more responsive to their needs as they define them. They want more research and empirical data and tailored studies to deal with the proliferation of donors coming into the region. The Vice President of Marshall Islands told story after story about donors or partners politely listening to his government, but ultimately doing what they wanted to do in the way that they wanted to do it. I've seen a bit of that myself. The third point I wanted to emphasize is Pacific agency and the forms it can and should take amongst our youth. Through PIDP's work, I frequently meet young Pasifika entrepreneurs and journalists, postgrad students, and emerging leaders as they undertake professional development training and pursue research at the East Bus Center. And I am often asked by them, what can I do better to be a better leader back home in my community? So answering this question is critical for advancing the collective potential of the Pacific at a regional level, but it's also the ultimate manifestation of agency at a personal level. So this is what I actually tell them. I have 3 points. Number 1, have high expectations of yourself and our leaders. Harnessing Pacific self-determination and utilizing our own agency means that we can throw off the shackles of low expectations. I've got lots of personal stories, but I'll save that for another time. I'm sure you'll have. Number 2, be impatient for change. Our Pacific region is a world leader and global activist in the fight against global warming and raising awareness of the real-life implications it's having on human existence in the Pacific. And we should be proud of our leaders for making an impact on the world stage and at the UN. But it's not enough, and change is not coming fast enough. We need our young people to be courageous and to use their voices and influence. We need our young people to demand that our leaders be more bold. But don't stop there. Let's be impatient for change in other areas of crisis in our communities. We are succeeding in framing climate change as a security issue that the industrialized world needs to fix for our own sakes. Let's also take action on existential threats that are within our own power to fix. Violence against women is a critical threat to the security of half the population of our region. We need to stop raping and beating and burning and killing our wives and sisters and cousins and mothers. We need to stop beating and killing our children. By definition, violence has no place in the Pacific, and we need to stop the violence against women and children right now. And lastly, this is actually the controversial point that I'm about to make now. Number 3, don't follow your passion, build skills. The utility of the advice to follow your passion has been the subject of considerable research, and there's ample evidence that suggests that doing that is unlikely to lead to a career of success or a satisfaction that generates effective agency. Instead, I urge the youth to get really good at something. If you want to contribute to our Blue Pacific, then get really, really good at something, and then stay in the region and do that thing that you're good at. Do I have any time left? One more. Okay. Okay, so the Blue identity, the Blue Pacific identity generates agency when we turn geographical challenges into opportunities. So our small island states become large island states. I wanted to just refer back, while I have the chance, to the North Pacific as a useful check. The late great statesman Tony de Brum had fondly pointed out that the equator is only an imaginary line. But just again, to echo the point of His Excellency here, often here in New Zealand when we're talking about the Pacific, we really just mean our Pacific. And it's a problem that's reflected at the regional level. For example, the last time I checked, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat employed around 100 staff, and of all those people, there's only one from the Micronesian, a gentleman from Kiribati. So does the Secretariat, which is a significant policy leader and increasing in influence, does that represent and reflect all the Pacific views? And to end, I would say, to advance our Pacific region, we need to be more inclusive in order to harness our diversity. And I believe that developing a genuinely inclusive Pacific perspective is key.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karina. Well, we run out of time now.